As the terracotta rooftops of Perinch came into view, Nepeta was reminded of Vathny, her hometown. It was flatter and muddier than Perinch, but had a similar atmosphere. Isolated and calm, seemingly far away from the troubles that threatened the rest of Maedra. Like Vermigold, her brother Theron had belittled her too, when she and her sister had been young. He would mock them for their failures, for being weaker than him, and he would constantly remind them that they were worthless, because they were girls, who would inherit nothing from their parents. Their parents never saw these interactions. He was cunning, but she had often wondered if they would care. He was their golden child, a product of their pampering. The two of them would often bicker and argue. He'd end up hitting her, but she was blamed for inciting the conflict. Perhaps it was true. She did make snide remarks and goad him, but it was not because she wanted to start a fight. She had always been jealous, not of his gender, not of their parents' favoritism, not even of his status and what he would inherit. Instead, her jealousy was for the freedom that he had. While he was allowed to play out in the sun, swim in the river, shout, scream, and run about, she and her sister were stuck indoors, learning to cook, clean, and sew. It wasn't that she inherently disliked those chores, but having no alternative had caused her to detest them. Now, so many years later, she felt no ill will towards her brother. In fact, she pitied him. Such a promising young man, born into a good family, handsome, and training to be a warrior, he was practically considered a hero based on what people expected he would achieve. But it all came to an abrupt end when the 17-year-old was stabbed to death in a drunken brawl. She had only been 13 at the time, but she saw the shift in her parents. Neither of them were ever the same after that day. They became distant, to her, her sister, and each other. It was little wonder that they didn't notice the long hours she spent hiding with Karina. "We're here." Vermigold's dull voice cut through her thoughts, and Nepeta took his outstretched hand, accepting his assistance to descend from the carriage and onto the dusty street. The buildings were constructed from clay bricks, and their original white paint had faded to a dull and yellowed grey. Though not particularly tall, their orange tiles gave the impression that the warm sunlight was dancing from their rooftops, and were a stark contrast against the deep blue of the sky above. Vermigold led her onwards, in a continued silence that she knew she must break. "I noticed that you had a particular distaste for that tome, Neddert's Arcana," she began uncertainly, recalling their earlier lesson, and attempting to overcome the uncomfortable distance she had created between them. "Were you, perhaps, acquainted with its author?" "Aye, I know him," he replied after a short pause. "He is my cousin." Nepeta wanted to inquire further, but decided against it, as a group of townsfolk came up the street towards them. The townsfolk stared down at her and Vermigold, with open hostility in their eyes. One of them even spat at their feet. Nepeta was shocked beyond words, and felt her blood beginning to boil, overcoming her tiredness. She took a step towards them and raised her hand, but Vermigold grabbed her wrist in an instant. "I understand that you are not used to this treatment, but it is best that we ignore them. I'd hate to cause a scene, as it would reflect badly on the Empire, and it might just start a cycle of violence that could quickly grow out of control." She couldn't understand how he kept so calm after being so blatantly disrespected, but she would not disobey him. Glowering, she glared after the townsfolk, who were already a fair way up the street, and gave no heed to her. "I don't get it, but fine," she said quietly, and followed Vermigold as he continued down the street. They passed several other folk, none of whom spoke a word to them, but their expressions were anywhere from fear to outright hatred. Vermigold just held his head high and ignored them, until they reached an extravagantly decorated clothing store. "Ah, Lord Vermigold," the colourfully clad trader cooed from behind the counter as the pair entered. "It is always a pleasure to have you in my shop." The merchant's voice practically sang, and Nepeta felt uneasy at the blatant pandering that was likely hiding similar resentment to that which they had seen in the streets. "It's a pleasure to be here, Vibur," Vermigold replied, apparently oblivious to the farce. "2 sets of fine garb for the girl," he continued, gesturing that Nepeta step forward. "Finally got yourself a young lover, eh?" the merchant asked, so sleazily that Nepeta had to resist the urge to hurl acid at him. "No, she is my apprentice," Vermigold replied, unfazed. Or so his voice suggested, but she saw that his fists were tightly clenched behind his back. "Yes, very good." Phoebe looked her up and down with hungry eyes that lingered uncomfortably. "Is it necessary to stare so?" Nepeta growled through her bared teeth. "Just sizing you up," the man replied with a shrug, and finally turned away. "You may find something in this collection. I'm sure there will be something suitable for one so gaunt." "Very good. Go ahead, Nepeta. Choose anything." Vermigold nodded her forward. She did so reluctantly, and despite the intolerable merchant, she managed to find several elegant pieces. In the end, she left wearing a long, lavender tunic, patterned with black vines and sparrow silhouettes, over a hazel-coloured winter dress. A long yellow dress, with white trim, was folded under her arm, alongside the loose-fitting dress Amalia had lent her. "I'm certain he overcharged you," Nepeta angrily muttered to Vermigold, as they left the store. "No doubt," the dwarf replied flatly. "But as I said before, I don't want to cause problems in Perinch. I'm here to watch over it, after all. And there is little other use for the coin I received from Daramon. Consider it the price of peace." "I don't know if I can accept that," Nepeta growled. "The people here are so—" "Unfortunate," Vermigold interrupted her. "They are unfortunate in their prejudice and jealousy, and so I pity them." It was the first time that Vermigold had spoken so hastily and plainly that Nepeta wasn't sure how to respond. She merely nodded and followed the dwarf to their next destination, pondering the situation. The townsfolk, who had been rather disinterested in her, treated her completely differently now that she was standing alongside Vermigold. She did not have long to dwell on this, however, as Vermigold led her into another shop, and her heart sank as she recognized the name on the sign above the door. Tahar's Exotics. "Nepeta!" Tahar boomed angrily as they entered the shop. "Where have you been? You were supposed to be working here until spring." "I never agreed to that, Tahar," she replied coldly, but she became increasingly nervous as the towering man ambled towards her. "You did! I paid you a week in advance." "Technically, that was because I mended the broken—" "Nonsense!" he growled, as he towered over her. "You think you are too good to work in my shop, you useless mage?" As he spoke, Tahar violently grabbed hold of Nepeta's left arm. "I would ask that you not accost my apprentice, Tahar," Vermigold spoke calmly, though he was a head shorter than Nepeta, and the merchant's angry face loomed over a foot above hers. Tahar's face was red with rage, as he glared down at Vermigold, his eyes bulging as he realized what was going on. "Apprentice!" He spluttered his disbelief aloud, and the colour drained out of his face. Nepeta found herself smirking smugly as he stared back at her. "Now, Tahar," Vermigold began, but Tahar cut him off. "Shut it!" With a surprising swiftness, the big man knocked Vermigold from his feet with a powerful backhand. "I've had enough of you! We all have!" As he shouted in rage, Tahar kicked the dwarf in the chest, winding him. "I ought to get rid of you for good," Tahar continued, maddened with rage. "Vermigold!" Nepeta cried out, as she dropped her bundled dresses and hastily started signing. But Tahar turned on her in an instant, clapping a huge hand over her mouth, stifling her incantation, and striking her head against the clay brick wall. Her eyes swam, and her knees went weak. She would have fallen if Tahar was not still holding her by her jaw and wrist. His eyes, burning with hatred, were locked on hers, as he lifted her higher, scraping the back of her head against the wall. As her head was spinning so violently, she wasn't sure exactly what Vermigold shouted from the ground, but his wand was out, and the room was suddenly drained of warmth, as Kraft's breath rushed towards it. All of a sudden, Tahar was no longer supporting her, and she fell heavily to the floor, losing consciousness. When her eyes slowly opened, she saw that Vermigold was kneeling over her. His left hand was supporting her head, while he held something in his right hand. A glass jar, with a tiny black beetle squirming inside. "Tahar?" Nepeta mumbled fearfully, and felt an overwhelming nausea rising in her, as she tried to look about for him. "Right here," Vermigold grinned, and shook the jar in front of her. "You... oh..." Her thoughts were slowed, and even though her head was pounding as if it might split, she couldn't help but giggle at the sight of the bug, before darkness overcame her once more. The remainder of that day, as with the several days that followed, was a blur of confusion. Memories, hallucinations, and reality slowly converged until she was hardly sure when she was dreaming and when she was awake. Bugs crawled over her skin. Then, in an instant, she was in an entirely black and white library, where a woman with violet hair, in a white and gold dress, was reading quietly at an ornate marble desk. The woman ignored her presence, and she soon awoke in a cold sweat, with Amalia wiping her brow with a wet cloth. She tried to speak, but her words were mumbled and broken. "Hush, child of Madra," Amalia whispered quietly, and then disappeared once more into the darkness that swallowed Nepeta's mind. Sometimes she awoke to find that it was her mother tending to her. Other times she swore she heard Garina's soft voice as she lay alone in the gloom. But eventually, the dreams always led her back to the mysterious monochromatic library. She wanted to reach the shelves, but she couldn't move. The books were there, promising immeasurable knowledge, but eternally out of her grasp. As she became more lucid, the library grew increasingly dim, and in the intermediate between consciousness and dreaming, she was able to understand that the scale of the library was immense. Shelves of books rose up further than she could see, and there were rows upon rows of them. The final time she found herself there, it was almost entirely obscured by a thick mist. But she saw the violet-haired woman once more, and tried to call out to her. No sound left her throat, but the woman looked up, with sharp golden eyes that tore through the mist and directly into Nepeta's soul. "It is too soon, child," the woman murmured, raising her hand gently to shoo her away. A moment later, Nepeta woke with a start, spluttering into full awareness with a sickening jolt, and never dreamed of that place again.